And friends, our scripture lesson this week is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 22, verses 15 through 22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. Well, it's election season, and we know we can try to get candidates in trouble by getting them to talk about taxes. But this isn't anything new. People have been getting in trouble for talking about taxes for thousands of years. And so in our passage today, we have two groups of religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Herodians, who think they can get Jesus in trouble by getting him to talk about the question of taxes. And so they ask him this question: "Tell us, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" Now you see, the Pharisees and Herodians actually have different perspectives on this answer. The Pharisees are not in favor of Rome. They do not like the Roman occupation. They do not like the Roman influence. And so if Jesus says that you should pay your taxes, the Pharisees and their followers will have nothing to do with Jesus. On the other hand, the Herodians are supporters. They're collaborators with Rome. And so if Jesus says that you should not pay taxes, the Herodians will report him to the authorities as being seditious. And so while the Pharisees and the Herodians have two completely different attitudes toward this question, they have a common dislike of Jesus, and they're hoping to trap him with whatever he might say. Now, in our passage this week, there are a lot of nuances to the language that I'll be going through. It's really important for understanding the passage. And one of them has to do with this word taxes. As you see it in the English, taxes can mean lots of different things. It's a generic word, right? Are we talking about income taxes or sales taxes or property taxes? But in the Greek, it's not a generic word for taxes that's used. It's a very specific word, and that word is kensos. It's a word from which we get the word census. And the reason why that tax was called the kensos and why it's related to the word census is that it was a tax that was assessed per person. And so each person had to pay the same tax. And later on in the passage, it mentioned the idea that the coin used to pay the tax was a denarius. And in many sermons, we've mentioned that a denarius is basically the daily wage of a typical laborer. And so you had to pay the tax of a day's wage per person. And in that time, a day's wage for a laborer was barely enough to live on for the day. So if you had to pay the kensos, if you had to pay that tax, your choice that day was between paying the tax and eating. So that the burden of that tax fell disproportionately on the poor, on the average worker. And those are people that we know Jesus cared about so much. And the Pharisees and the Herodians knew Jesus cared about them. And so they asked him about this particular tax because they knew that because of Jesus' passion for social justice, he might be particularly upset at that tax. Because this tax hit the poor. It hit the working person. It hit the average person so hard that they thought that they could lure him into saying something intemperate by preying on his love, his desire that there be justice in the world. And that's a little bit of a lesson for us, that sometimes when it comes to our faith, we can be vulnerable at the point of our greatest passion. You see, when things are a little bit distant from us, it can sometimes actually be easier to be faithful. We can be tempted to cut corners when we're at our most passionate. Let me give you an example. For example, right, who among us isn't really passionate about our loved ones? We love our loved ones. And so when Jesus tells us to forgive, we can forgive things that aren't that close to us. Maybe we can easily forgive things that happen to us. But you do something to a loved one, I think for most of us, that can be the hardest thing to forgive. And so at that point of greatest passion is sometimes the greatest vulnerability to not live into the principles that Jesus has asked us to live by. And so they were hoping that they could turn that against Jesus, but he doesn't fall for it. Instead, what he does is he asks them for an example of that coin, that denarius that is used to pay the tax. And when he takes that coin, he looks at it, and he sees Caesar's head on it, but he asks them, whose head is this? He asks them because he knows that he's going to expose their hypocrisy. And how is he going to expose it? He's going to expose it because they have that coin with them. You see, that image of Caesar is idolatry because Caesar is a god. And so Caesar is a fake god, a false god. And having the image of a false god, that's idolatry. And this is why you weren't supposed to even have a Roman coin in the temple. If you remember the story of Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers, well, those money changers are literally money changers. They would take people who were coming to the temple to give their offering, and they would take their Roman coins and trade them for special temple coins, and those temple coins had no images of Caesar on them. But they were charging an extraordinary exchange rate. It was the worst possible rate, worse than traveling overseas and changing your money at the airport, which most of us have learned never to do, right? And so they were taking advantage of these people who were trying to honor the temple by not bringing their Roman coins into the temple. And yet these religious leaders had those exact Roman coins with them. Jesus asks them to produce one, and there it is, an idolatrous coin that they have. Now, this issue of idolatry, this issue of idolatrous images, is one that has been a part of many religious traditions and presented a lot of challenges over the centuries. And there's very specific language that has evolved around this question of image and the divine. And that language plays a role in our story here. Because even though you see that the verse was translated with the word head, that's not the word that's in the Greek. The word that's in the Greek is a Greek word that came directly into English, and it's this word icon. Jesus asks, whose icon is this? And icon can have very specific religious connotations. It's a notable word. And it's particularly notable in the Judeo-Christian tradition because we know that the idea of image, of icon, goes back to the very beginning of creation. In fact, in the Genesis story, right, we remember this verse. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And that word image, well, when they translated the Hebrew into the Greek, that word image was translated as icon. We were created in the icon of God. You were created in the icon of God. Every human being was created in the icon of God. And so when he asks about the icon on the coin, Jesus is implicitly invoking this concept from the creation story. And that should inform the way we hear his answer to them. His answer is, right, to give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, sometimes we hear this and we mistakenly believe that what Jesus is trying to tell us to do is divide our lives and divide our world into competing loyalties, to divide our lives into an arena that is God and an arena that is Caesar, an arena that is secular, an arena that is somehow not God. But you can't do that. You cannot divide your life into the realms of God and not God. It doesn't work that way, and I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. I don't think Jesus is in any way trying to encourage us to think of our lives as having a godly realm and a non-godly realm. I don't think Jesus in any way would suggest that we would be, godly on Sunday and then not so on Monday, that on Monday it's into the world of Caesar. I don't think that's at all what Jesus is ever trying to tell us to do. Instead, when you hear that answer of Jesus, I would paraphrase it this way. Give to Caesar what is made in the image of Caesar, and give to God what is made in the image of God. Now, when you hear that, what does it mean? What does it mean when you hear that and remember that you and I were made in the image of God? It means that we have to give ourselves to God. We have to give our lives to God. But what does that look like? When you give your life to God, what does that look like? Does that mean that you should just spend every waking moment in prayer and contemplation? That's not a bad thing. But I think that we were actually designed to be able to interact with the world. Okay? See, I've never believed that we're supposed to separate ourselves from the world. That's why I don't like this idea of bifurcating our lives into God and not God. Because when we do that, sometimes we do that believing that we need to protect the godly part from the non-godly part. And I don't believe that that's our call at all. In fact, I believe that that is a fearful way of looking at that separation. Instead, understanding the power of God, we are supposed to interact with those less godly parts of the world, knowing that the godly will influence the not godly. We're supposed to interact with that world. Right? We're not fearful that the godly will be polluted by the non-godly, but instead we believe that the godly can transform the non-godly. And so when we give our lives to God, I don't think we do so by separating ourselves out from the non-godly, but instead we devote ourselves to interacting with the world in a godly way. Now, how can we think about that? How can we think about what that looks like? I have an analogy that might seem a little unusual, but it has to do with something that I learned to do about a year ago. And that was I learned to make my own pie crust. Now, I used to make pies, and I would use a store-bought crust. And it was okay. But when I first learned to make pie crust, it was really eye-opening. I learned what a difference it made. That homemade crust just made the whole pie better. All right. That homemade crust, just making it yourself, getting it so that it was just of a different kind of texture and flavor than what you get when it's store-bought. It made the whole pie better. But here's the thing about pie crust and pie. Nobody eats just crust. Right? You don't just eat the crust. You don't bake a pie crust and eat it plain. You would never do that. But instead, that crust holds the filling. It holds the filling. It holds it together. And you also never eat the filling by itself. Who would do that? Who just takes spoonfuls of pie filling? No. Right? Instead, what you have is this crust that holds the filling together, and then when you eat the pie, what you want is a little bit of crust and some filling in every bite. There's got to be crust and filling in every single bite. It goes together. It makes it better. And that homemade crust sure beats one that's store-bought. The way an authentic faith sure beats one that is just by rote. And so how do we live a life where we get that little bit of God in everything that we do? I think we consciously try to include God in every aspect of our lives. See, sometimes I think we only go to God in prayer for the big things. And I think that cuts God out of so much of our lives. But what would it be like if for at least the next week, or hopefully longer, but at least start with a week, that you decided that you would invite God and include God in every tiny aspect of your life? What about if you just resolved to think about God, pray to God? And I'm not talking about the fall on your knees kinds of prayers, but the little prayer, the short prayer where you just kind of think about God for a bit and thought about God before you did the tiniest thing. What if you thought about God before you ran an errand? And just asked God to be with you as you did that. What if you said a little prayer before you went for a walk? What if you made sure to say grace before every meal and even before every snack? Doesn't have to be long and involved, but just enough to remind you of the presence of God in that moment in your life. See, if we try to include God in everything that we do, I think it makes everything better. I think too many times we've tried to just eat the filling without the crust. And it just doesn't taste right. But if we try to include God in every part of our lives, think about God as often as we can, then we are indeed giving to God that which was made in the image of God, that which was made in the icon of God, which is you, me, and everyone we know. So let's try to include God in everything and see how much better our lives feel. Amen.